The next seam finish that we're going to work on is something called turned under clean finished. So the very first step that you're going to do is put the rectangles on the ironing board with the underside facing the ceiling. You will fold under 1/4 of an inch, which is the second line on your seam gauge. Seam gauge is based in 1/8 of an inch. So the second line, so the first one is 1/8, the second one is 1/4. So you're going to move your slider so that the blue goes right to the 1/4 of an inch. Then you will fold under 1/4 of an inch of the material by placing the fold against the blue slider, and the edge, raw edge of the fabric will be at the silver edge of the seam gauge. Once you have that marked, you're just going to take the hot tip of the iron and press it down. You will continue doing the same thing across. If your samples are on grain, all you need to do at this point is just kind of tug that far corner and it will fall on grain. Double check with the seam gauge that you're at the 1/4 of an inch, and that one's all set. Now we'll do it on this one. Fold under, mark, measure the 1/4 of an inch, press, you will find this seam finish in very well-made clothing, like couture style clothing. This is a very time-consuming seam finish. It looks beautiful inside a tailored skirt, a men's tailored suit, but it does take some effort to do it. Once you get them pressed, bring it over to your sewing machine. If you do a nice job pressing, you don't need to use pins on it. But for my new sewers, if you feel more comfortable, you can put some pins along the way just to make sure that it holds it where it needs to be. So I will pin one and I'll leave one unpinned so you can see the difference in sewing. When you're pinning, you want to make sure that the pin is going in and coming out in the fabric. So this one's wrong, but this one is right. So you want to make sure that when you pin down and you pin up, that it holds that fabric down. Okay. Now what you're going to do is stitch at 1/8 of an inch. So looking at the presser foot, if the edge of the foot is 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 will be on the inside of what I call the presser toe, which is right there where my fingernail is. That is the 1/8 of the inch. It's also the inside edge, or right edge, of the oval on the presser foot. So by lining this up so that the edge of the fabric is right over on the right-hand side of the oval, or on the inside of the toe, you will be all set to stitch your 1/8 of an inch. 3 forward, 3 back, and then go for it. And again, you're making sure that the edge or the fold is right on the inside of that toe. And that one's all set. This one I didn't put pins on, so let's take a look and see how this one will get stitched. You will line it up the same. Folded edge against the inside of the toe. Forward 3 stitches and back 3. Without the pins, you can just zoom right down the seam. And when you get to the end, back stitch and pull it off. Now what you'll do, you'll pin it just like you've been pinning things right along. Sometimes this happens with the sewing machine when you have such a tiny little seam allowance. We'll clean that up. Actually, my scissors are here. We'll clean it up here. You're just going to trim those off. It happens. It bothers some people, but there's really, you're just asking the needle to do something it doesn't want to do, piercing the edge of the fabric, so it makes the thread sometimes not up. And one more. Okay. Now what you'll do is you'll put right sides facing up. Make sure that your stitched edges are facing each other. Close it like a book, and you're going to pin these together with pins this time, even if they're pressed. You're going to use pins. We can't get in the habit of not using pins, but sometimes when that seam is so tiny, like that 1/4 that we folded over, and you're just stitching 1/8, sometimes pins make it more cumbersome. So now we're holding 2 samples together. We're going to be stitching through 2 layers of fabric, but we're dealing with 4 layers because where it's folded over is 2 layers on each side. Alright, once we get to the end, now I ask you, again, a little bit of math. If our normal seam allowance is 5/8, but we've already turned it over 1/4 inch, then this seam allowance will need to be 5/8 minus 1/4. So you can figure out the math in your head, or you can do what I like to do. Find the 5/8, and I need to move this way 2/8. So that's 1 line and then 2 lines. So I know I'm lining this up at 3/8 to stitch. Or you know in your head that 5/8 minus 1/4 inch is 3/8. So this final seam must be 3/8. Okay, and trim my threads. Take it over to your ironing board. Wake up your iron. You will finger press it, just like we've been doing. Finger press. Take your iron. This one's a little harder to press because you're going through more layers here where it's folded over. Flip it over. Give it the final press. And then again, you can take a look at your seams. They look very similar from the outside. As long as they're still the same length, same measurement, you've done a great job. Okay, and again, they look similar from the outside, but different on the inside. This is a much higher quality seam finish. You will find it in couture clothing. You'll find it in very expensive men's dress shirts, men's suits, this type of seam finish, where this is what's found in most manufactured things that are inexpensive.